You're listening to the Yeshiva of Newark at IDT podcast. I'm your host and curator, Rabbi Kivlevitz, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Hi, this is the Projectionist Has Semicha. We had a great conversation, Yitzhak and I, with Thomas Shubilla, who wrote a book recently called Primetime 1966-1967, The Full Spectrum of Television's First All-Color Season. And he's a very knowledgeable, enthusiastic person. He also is a professor of speech communication at Luzerne County Community College. So as you can imagine, with Yitzchak, myself, and Tom, we could have really gone on for hours about 60s television and its antecedents, its similarities to film and radio. So I cut this conversation into two. So part one, although I don't have exactly what is in here, we start really talking about Tom's passion and how he gets into it, and just throwing out a lot of different programs, and really what programs really suffered from becoming colorized. And I sort of put a stop, not so arbitrarily, when we get to variety programs of the 1960s and how they fared in color. Part two, which you'll be hearing, takes it from where Tom started, which is really his analysis of the Batman television show and the Green Hornet television show. And we start talking about, I think, some serious questions about artistic integrity and colorization of film. So here's part one of our talk with Thom Shubilla, and I hope you enjoy it. Clear the aisles. The Projectionist Has Semicha. Hi. I'm not here with Yitzchak tonight, but he's on his way. Instead, I have someone that I don't think has smicha, but he is a professor from the Luzerne Community College, located in some wonderful hamlet in Pennsylvania. What hamlet is that, Professor?
Luzerne County, right outside of Wilkes-Barre.
Right out of Wilkes-Barre. A great community college. I went on their website, and I know that they have 30,000 graduates or something like that. And they are lucky indeed to have with them a professor of communications, speech communications, Professor Thomas Shubilla, who has recently published a book that is really, I don't know, it's something like hotcakes, isn't it?
Yes, I'm doing very well with it.
I think it's better than Lisa Douglas's hotcakes.
Much better.
Of course, Lisa Douglas's hotcakes you could use for many, many reasons, as Oliver used to show you. Yes, everything. Yes, you could do everything for Lisa's, but it's actually going off the shelves. And the name of the book is, what is the name of the book?
Primetime 1966-67.
But it has another name. It's called
the full spectrum. The first season of the full spectrum of first full season of Full Spectrum of Color.
Yes. It's a tough name to get. Basically, it's a color because you actually traced with a lot of verve, and I don't have a copy of the book yet, but it's with a lot of verve and interesting insight. That first season of color TV, where I guess all the programs of the three major networks were color. I guess that's the prop, right?
That is the premise of the book. When I started doing some research, and I had some project in mind about. I wanted to talk about Batman. I wanted to talk about the era, so 1966, which I think is just an incredible year for television and pop culture. And I wanted to document something from that era, and I wasn't 100% sure of what that would be. And
so it's sort of like, Tolkien said. Tolkien said that, where did he get the idea of the Lord of the Rings? He said he went under a tree, and as he was dozing, he had a dream. And in the dream, a hobbit came to him in the dream. The hobbit took him by the hand and just led him. So basically, you sort of like started off In other words, The Hobbit took you by the hand,
Yes.
and it took you on an odyssey, and then it became clear to you what that odyssey was.
Yes, I ran across this, just kind of interesting fact. It was just a bite of information that was the first season that every show was in color, and I said, that's something, that's interesting, and I felt like it needed to be more than a footnote in history. It needed to be more than a Wikipedia page. It was something that needed to be documented.
Now, I'm going to talk to you a lot about that year, because you, of course, are a relatively young person, but I actually remember that year, and I think I told this to you on the phone the other day. It was one of the years. I'm 62, so I was born in 1960, and although I was born with European parents and we spoke Yiddish as a first language, they plopped me in front of the television, or at least I found my way to the television, which was not a color television. A color television did not enter our home until I was way into my teenage years. We couldn't afford a color television. No, we don't get one. But I knew, because every single program, as I remember, said, especially NBC, in living color. That, I think, was NBC's, right? NBC's item. In fact, the whole peacock, which became the NBC symbol, was based on the fact that NBC felt that they were out there as sort of pioneers in color. Again, I know that this is really your area, not mine, but I do know that one of the first programs that NBC pushed and wanted people to watch NBC for, there were two programs specifically, and they were both Sunday night programs. Yeah. One of them was Bonanza, which was in color. And part of the beauty of Bonanza was the fact that you could see these vistas. Again, it might have been in some back lot, I don't know, but at least there was enough. They did enough second unit shooting that they were able to give you the illusion that you could see the color of the Ponderosa and beyond.
Yes, you were somewhere on the frontier. Yeah. NBC, certainly pushed it with.
And the other show, of course, it was called The Wonderful World of Disney, which later was called The Wonderful World of Color.
Yes.
Right.
So they certainly pushed it, and actually NBC was the first, the first to air a show in color. So January 1st, 1954, they aired the Tournament of Roses parade. So that was on New Year's Day. I think 15 or 16 days earlier, the FCC finally approved color for that color broadcast. So. We became the first, so America became the first country with color, and then NBC quickly jumped on it, and CBS actually did later that day. I think they aired the news. I think it was the national news. News and Review. They aired in color in '54.
So this was part of your research. So really, I think what was fascinating was that although televisions were being bought already in the late 40s en masse, when were color TVs being sold from retailers that people could buy them?
So 54, the first color TVs were manufactured. Nobody had one, and mostly because there weren't any color shows. A couple of years later, about 56, 57, Red Skelton switched over to color. The Milton Berle show switched over to color for a bit. Texaco Star Theater switched over to color for a bit. But again, nobody really had color televisions. And ABC actually didn't have any color programming until 62. And actually, by 1966, I think it was 9% of the population had color televisions. Like only 9. So the switch to color was for a very small minority of television viewers.
But there were statistical gurus who knew that once the price would go down, in other words, once the manufacturers were able to get them produced en masse, like the black and whites, the demand would create a lowering of the price. And therefore they saw, just like Bill Gates and others who developed computer technology or whoever developed the iPhone and others, they realized that it would be the wave of the future and that everybody would want one.
Right. And even earlier than that, even earlier than those 1950s, and we talked about it on the phone a little bit, but like I said, the last, I think, 2 seasons of The Adventures of Superman, they were shot in color, never aired in color until the late 60s, early 70s. Same thing with 2 westerns. Cisco Kid was shot in color, never aired in color until much later. And Sergeant Preston of the Yukon. Both those shows shot entirely in color, never aired in color until much later. Because again, like you said, some numbers television guru said, you know what? We better future-proof this. We better shoot this in color now. And because people are going to have color TVs in the future, and this is something that a show then we can sell in syndication.
And syndication and residuals. I don't believe Sergeant Preston on the Yukon is airing anywhere in the world today, is it?
Not today. I don't think it is airing today. However, and neither is the Cisco Kid. I doubt. Adventures of Superman pops up every so often. Just it's Superman, but it certainly aired a lot in the 70s and into the 80s.
Now, shooting in color, look, I don't know much about filmmaking, although I talk about it a lot. I would assume that it was much more expensive to shoot things in color. Right?
Yes.
And the technology, the film, I don't know if the quality held up. I know a lot of the a lot of the color programming that you see now, not the kinescopes, but for example, I know it's one of the programs I think you talk about in your book, they really need restoration. Like, for example, the program that I remember, was it that year too? It's About Time? Was that from 66?
Okay. 1960, yes.
Okay. So now I want to tell you one thing. Yitzhak is here now. I felt as I was driving here to turn on the computer, I said, we got to have a jingle, we got to have a jingle. But because really, and bear with me on this, Professor Shubilla, I think that this was not only a crossover year for programs to become in color, it was also a year that the theme song started to fade out. In other words, the idea of a song, a long one, like a minute or so, telling you the theme of the show, like, Cousins, or Gilligan's Island, right? Or like the Patty Duke show. But you have, for example, the 2 programs that we talked about that went from black and white to color, that were sort of clones of each other, which were, of course, I Dream of Jeannie and Bewitched. Neither of them had words to their music, right? Dun 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 dun. Dolly likes that too. Dun 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 dun. And then Bewitched was do 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 do, right? And I think, by the way, the theme songs are indicative of, like, again, as I said to you on the phone the other day, I Dream of Jeannie has sort of a salacious tune to it.
Yeah.
Da, 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 da. It's it's almost like a burlesque tune, right? Da, 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 da,
exactly.
Da, 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 right? Whereas Bewitched is sort of like, and they both had, they were all very heavy duty, like many of these openings with animation, like even the original I Love Lucy program, not the one that came up in syndication. The original I Love Lucy program also started with an animation, and those Lucy and Desi figures, which of course were important because I think Benson and Hedges or whatever it was, I think helped create these little cartoon images in order to sell their cigarettes more. But I think there was, it seems to me that this was a year that some of the theme songs, I think, like the one you started with, right? Batman, right?
Batman.
I mean, Batman has one word, right? Right?
Certainly. And Batman, but with It's About Time, and that's certainly a theme song. That's
right. So, and I think it's sort of like still an old, like it's sort of like let's do, because one of the things that I think the '60s brought out in the early '60s, even before '66, and we've talked about it on this program, was, what we need to do? We need to be, there's one arm of the 60s was Sylvan, rural, sketching this beautiful life of what rural life was. And then there was this other arm, like, that's like the Andy Griffith Show, right? Then the other arm of the 60s was crazy. The other arm was weird and strange, whether it's, the Munsters and the Addams Family, or any strange permutation, like we can do it. Like it was a weird, My Favorite Martian, right? Which I think, now My Favorite Martian, did it ever make it into color?
It did. Its last season, it did make it into color. So there was one color season of yes.
Ray Walston, and both of these guys are superstars, really. Ray Walston and Bill Bixby. Bill Bixby is probably the king of television in a way, right? I'm saying but Ray Walston was a great character actor in a lot of Hollywood flicks, and he could do a lot of stuff. You might remember him from Damn Yankees. I think he was the devil himself in Damn Yankees.
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah, sure. With Tab Hunter, I think, plays plays Joe over there. But anyway, the point being is that My Favorite Martian, I'm not sure. I think it might have had a theme song to it, but that's really It's About Time was sort of like a My Favorite Martian type of idea, which is it has astronauts in it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right, and the astronauts end up going back in time, right? It's about time. It's about space, right? And somehow, unfortunately, I had such, in Yiddish we say Rachmanis. I had such Rachmanis on Imogene Coca, right? That she had to play. She played Gronk's wife. I forgot what her name was, right? Jag, right? And then you had, of course, Joey Yitzchak. What?
Joe E. Ross. Yes.
Joey Ross, right? Who to me will always be from Car 54.
Yes.
For me, but he was basically playing the same character, right? He was basically, Joey Ross was pretty much the same Car 54 character, just he was wearing it looks terrible. It was in color, but it was not preserved in any way.
Kinescope, was it?
I don't think it was kinescope. It was certainly shot. But yeah, I don't think that they put the money into the color that, say, The Invaders did or Bonanza did, and I would assume that they thought it was a throwaway show. However, it was produced by Sherwood Schwartz, who did bring us Gilligan's Island. Speaking of another iconic theme song,
yes, but remember.
That's why I'm thinking it's just the preservation was so poor. It's not that probably when it was originally aired, it was the same type of color as you would have seen on the television at that time in Gilligan's Island or something else.
So what is it, Tom? Has more effort been made to preserve Batman and the Gilligan's Island episodes?
Those shows aired. Those shows, they still air.
So in other words, even though it was shot in color, is more expensive, it still needs tech work. It still needs tech work today
The problem with physical media, it deteriorates, unfortunately, and I don't think anybody wants to sink any money into preserving It's About Time, unfortunately.
I heard they're working on it. I think maybe
really?
Shout Factory might be working on it.
Oh, yeah, they do a really great job with that kind of stuff too.
So really, it was more expensive to shoot, but it's still it wasn't a guarantee of longevity, right?
No,
that's my point.
There's another show that aired that season, and I did find it difficult to find full episodes, but there was only 4 episodes that aired. It was called the Tammy Grimes Show. She was a singer. I remember. She was a singer. Yeah, she was in the Broadway play Unsinkable Molly Brown. Sure. And actually, she was the original. She was in the running for Bewitched, to be Samantha early on, and. You can't conceive of anybody else playing Samantha besides. Yeah, I know. Elizabeth. And, I think that's part of the reason why the ridiculous film that they made with Nicole Kidman. Yeah. First of all, it made no sense, the movie. And there's really, I'm saying there's certain people that can't be replaced. I think
Elizabeth Montgomery can't be replaced. You cannot replace her.
I think she's incredible. And we've talked about this. I always thought.
Right. Well, we talked. Yitzchak, we had a discussion about Barbara Eden versus Elizabeth Montgomery, and as I said, again, the show was obviously. I'm surprised ABC didn't try to sue. I think NBC was.
NBC aired Genie. Yes.
I'm surprised they didn't try to sue them.
Well, I guess it's far enough away that it's not an exact replica.
Well, look, one thing I think we all agree that, and I talked about this to you on the phone. Like it's about time. I think only lasted one season. I don't think it lasted one season.
Actually, it almost was canceled mid-season, but Sherwood Schwartz said, "Okay, look, here's what we're going to do. We're going to get the astronauts and the cavemen."
I remember to the future, right?
Yes,
right.
So, and they said, well, there'll be more storyline opportunities in the 21st.
It'll be a more interesting fish out of water story if we put the cavemen there.
It's also easier to film a contemporary show. It's easier to make. Was it Escape from Planet of the Apes than to make Planet of the Apes or Beneath the Planet of the Apes? Because you just had to have the weird characters in the contemporary.
Right, and obviously, people at those days when people were the Nielsen ratings and people were making phone calls, you have to wonder what the science was that was determining the cancellation of a program.
Yeah. Sometimes it was. That's what I said about the Tammy Grimes show. It only lasted 4 episodes. Usually they give you, at least 12.
1 second. What about Me and the Chimp? Me and the Chimp with Ted Bessel did not last. I don't know how long that lasted. I think that got off in 2 episodes. I think they got rid of it.
Canceled that midway through the first commercial break.
Again, I don't know what the mechanism was, but one of the things you see, we talked about My Favorite Martian a minute ago, is that some shows really didn't survive, or maybe were better off, as I was mentioning the other day, better off in black and white.
Yes.
And I don't know exactly what the artistic dynamic is, but maybe especially a show that the main feature was the characterization.
Yeah.
The color might have diffused the strength of the show. Why don't you talk about that?
Yeah. So actually, after we started talking about this, you got my mind racing on this one, and I started thinking of different shows that certainly got worse with color, and shows that got better with color or made sense.
Okay, go ahead.
So we talked about Adventures of Superman. Again, when they started shooting in color, the storyline started getting really goofy, and the early episodes were really violent. They were really noirish, and it was this more serious show. But I think they started taking some liberties when they switched to color, even though nobody really saw it in color until much later. We talked about the Lucy show. So like we said, no longer Lucy could hide that she was getting older.
Right. She was extremely vain. I mean, she was an incredible businesswoman. She was a pioneer. She was a very gifted, adept physical comedian. She was a tough broad. And I have Rahmanas, as I said, about her life, but she was extremely vain. And, part of I think in the original I Love Lucy, she didn't want Vivian Vance because she thought Vivian might outshine her. And I think there was like a clause that she had to dress frumpy Ethel, right, etc. And
she was married to Fred.
She married to Bill Frawley, right? And we've talked about Bill Frawley in the '40s and the films he was in with Alan, with Errol Flynn and Alan Hale Sr. So he was I saw a little bit of J.K. Simmons imitating him on Amazon Prime in this program, like meeting the Ricardos. But you're right. Basically, the idea was Lucy was always vain, but as she ran, and again, she ran a studio that was also on a pioneer of coloring, right? Desilu was
and put out Mission Impossible, Star Trek, some really great shows.
So she, of course, had to be on television again. But as you said, she suffered in color, and the program suffered.
Definitely suffered in color, and and we were saying, as every show went on, it got worse and worse. It was, I Love Lucy, great. Lucy and Desi Comedy Hour, really good. The Lucy Show, Here's Lucy was awful.
Right. I have to tell you, the Lucy Show, again, the saving grace of the Lucy Show was one of her close friends was Gail Gordon.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah,
yes. I really like Gail Gordon on that. Yeah.
I'm saying
I like Gail Gordon on anything. I mean, I was thinking about, I mean, it's a little bit off topic, but it's a similar trajectory. I listened to many episodes of Armis Brooks on the radio, but I saw a few episodes on television. There was never any color episodes. I think the movie was also in black and white, but which was kind of almost like a reboot before reboots were a thing. But the TV show, it always had to have some kind of a slapstick thing, and it was exactly what you're talking about in the Superman show, going from black and white to color. How, like you said, the Superman show was much more of a serious show, and then going to color, it got goofy, and there was the Martians and all kinds of characters.
Okay, so one second, hold on. Let's talk about. Let me interrupt you about this, because comics is my. Again, I lived with comics. Part of obviously the strange appeal of superheroes, and we're going to talk about superhero serials, and we're going to talk about 66 and 67 in a minute with Batman and Green Hornet. But one of the things was, we cannot replicate the comic book. However, because the comic book, of course, was brilliant colors. That's the reason kids bought comics. They bought comics because what could be drawn and brought to life was brilliant and sometimes even beautiful, depending on on who was drawing it. And the kid, it could really be something. The serials, like the original Batman serials, they couldn't in any way, shape, or form reproduce what Bill Kane and Robinson were able to do. And the same thing's true about Superman. Obviously, in the comic, Wayne Boring, whoever was drawing Superman at that time, George Kuppenberg, Cary Bates, Kurt Swan. Cary Bates was the author. Kurt Swan. Their images were great, but the hero was so popular that they figured kids would want to watch the show. So what they did was they realized there's no way we can maybe do a little shtick with him flying, but we can't do X-ray vision. We can't do we can't have him pick up the planet Earth and spin it around or go to Saturn. So they needed at that time to basically turn it into like a noir crime issue, right? Superman, able to leap tall buildings in a single bound, right? Yes. Right,
faster than a speeding bullet.
But he wasn't faster in the comics. He was actually faster than the speed of light. Right, yeah. Superman in the 50s and 60s became incredibly powerful to the point that they didn't even know what to do with him in the stories. So that's why I believe that we can get the kids there. We'll call it Superman. It's not really like the comic. It's more like the 1930s comic when it started. So it had to be more like you say, a detective story, right? Whereas as color came in, I think what kicked in was, we've got color, we've got to make it more like the comic book. There's got to be a Toy Man, there's got to be a Lex Luthor, there has to be a Brainiac, or whatever it is that was one of these grotesque color creatures. And I think that probably was the downfall, because they weren't able to create a program. They didn't have the means to replicate a comic at all.
And also, I think also at the time, that's an early indication where they said, hey, we really have to tone this down a little bit. It's dark, and maybe some parent television council is going to come after us. We really have to lighten up these storylines because kids are watching this. So I think that this was an early example of that.
Yeah. And I guess one of the great crossovers was when George Reeves shows up on the Lucy Show.
Yeah. Yes.
And I Love Lucy. When George shows up. I think that's one of the programs I can, it's hard for me to watch I Love Lucy, but that's one of the shows I think I can watch. To see George Reeves jump through the kitchen from the Ricardo's kitchen there. It almost gives you the illusion, right? And of course, one of the best lines that any of the 50s programs ends with: "You're married to her for 10 years and they call me Superman." A really great delivery from George Reeves too at that point. So you said your mind was racing, but
my mind was racing. I came up with things that got worse by color. I said Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea. So in 65, switched to color, and they started.
Now that was with Richard. That was Richard Basehart, I believe.
Yes.
Now Richard Basehart was a guy who could have made it, and he did a number of great Hollywood noirs. He did a real great one. I forgot what it was, where he sort of plays two roles. I wish I remembered it, but he's sort of like, it's like an incredible character study. And they got Richard Basehart, who was like a B actor, and he was the star. I think he was the commander of that of the
submarine.
Of the submarine. So
and that season they again got a little out of hand with your characters. It became more of a creature feature kind of thing, as I described it in the book, where it was almost like a weekly monster. They're werewolves and things like that. And for me, I think that's kind of cool, but may not have been for everybody.
What about Combat? Was Combat?
Combat did switch to color, but I don't think really Combat, suffered much. It was the kind of the same show. It didn't really.
But I remember ABC had their own version of Combat in 66, 67, which was called the Rat Patrol.
Rat Patrol, yes.
Right. Did that was only a color show, right?
The Rat Patrol was only in color, yeah.
Right, and that was ABC's answer. I think Vic Morrow, I believe, was the star of Combat, right?
And it's kind of like, the 60s were kind of this height of World War II shows where they just wanted to do something with World War II, whether it was a comedy of
like Hogan's Heroes,
or Combat, or whatever. They just kind of wanted this.
Well, look, Hollywood is still mining World War II, right? Yes. Inglourious Bastards, or even there was one, the one about Churchill, the movie about Churchill a couple of years ago.
The Darkest Hour.
Darkest Hour. I mean,
television really isn't. That's except the History Channel, things like that. But like as far as scripted programs of television, do we really have any contemporary?
Well, but I guess you have to think, it's like, what's going to be the raison d'etre? Like, Hogan's Heroes was, again, incredibly bad taste, life in a concentration camp, right? With a bunch of funny Nazis, right? With a bunch of funny, and I know they were trying to make fun of the Nazis. I know that
they were Jewish,
right? Yes, the two Nazis were Jewish. Yes, we know.
Nazis were Jewish.
Yes, right. And so was, I think, one of the POWs, the French fellow.
Yeah, he was. I think he was even.
He was a Holocaust survivor. Yes,
he was a survivor. So
he was a Holocaust survivor. Yes,
but and I was looking at interviews of the characters at the time, or the actors at the time, I should say, and it was brought up a couple times, and all the actors were like, "No, it's a TV show. Don't worry about it."
Right. Nobody. Only Mad Magazine did a satire. I think it was 67 or 68, where they basically said, we can't believe that this is a show. And actually, I think the last, in the Mad Magazine satires, the last panel would be something outrageous. I think it was actually with Hitler himself or something like that. And it was, it really, like Feldstein and company, or William Gaines, whoever was publishing that at the time, realized that this show was an abomination. It was an obscene program, right?
I think it was, the one thing I looked at was, one of the big sources that I had was Broadcasting Magazine, which was an industry magazine, and before every season, it looked at all the pilots that the networks were looking at, and so it would say, okay, the Monkees. Okay, the Monkees is a show about kids at wacky show about kids in a band who want to be the Beatles, or that wasn't it, but whatever. And I think their review of Hogan's Heroes was some Jewish lads play Nazis, and a comedy about Jewish lads playing Nazis or something like that. And I was like, oh, okay. So nobody thought anything of this.
I see. You talked about the Monkees. Now that was a show that also premiered in 1966. The Monkees, yeah. Now, like you said, it was feeding off the Beatles fad.
Yes.
And the truth was that it's an incredible program because none of these four were actually originally singers, right? And I think
Mike Nesmith, he was a musician,
right?
And Mick, not Mickey Dolenz, Davy Jones. He had a hit. He had a minor hit song,
right. But I think part of it was that they created this television group. And then I think originally, again, you can check your facts on this. I think originally they brought in other singers and they lip synced to it. And then eventually the Monkees actually sang themselves.
Yeah, they were cast, obviously as the group. The music was canned. They never played the music. It was mostly the Wrecking Crew. So the studio musicians, the Wrecking Crew, they did the vocals originally, but then eventually they wanted a little bit more autonomy and kind of control over their music and things like that. So
and the show really had, unlike, let's say we talked about My Favorite Martian and It's About Time, which was sort of basically wacky early 60s show. This show really had a certain type of absurdist sensibility. The Monkees did.
Oh,
yeah. They did.
It was almost a Marx Brothers episode. I mean, if you think about it.
But they used camera technique to do absurd things. It was almost like it was very similar to some of the quickies in Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In.
Yeah.
Like in other words, like a character in one scene didn't have to be the same character in the next scene. They broke the fourth wall. They did. It was sort of an absurdist program. It was very similar to the Beatles' own movie that they made. Yeah. The Beatles movie, Yes, right? Help. I mean, I got to switch that. But it's similar to sort of like
absolutely. Yeah, and that's certainly what a basic idea was kind of make a Americanized Beatles, but it's kind of incredible that they're still fondly remembered, that they remained a band for so long too.
Right, and Davy Jones became a teenage heartthrob. People would have, can you imagine that? I can't imagine any girl today putting Davy Jones on in her bedroom, but
you never know.
Yeah, well,
so other shows that I had thought of. Again, another one that we talked about, Man from U.N.C.L.E. Again, that first season, it was more of a, it was a little bit more serious. It was more of a James Bond show than when it switched to color. Kind of got silly. We talked about the Wild Wild West.
Let's talk about that for a minute, because really, I mentioned to Tom the other day that I remember Tom and Yitzchak here are of the same age, and they are like I guess curators of the past, and you're talking to me about my past that I lived in. So to me, the Wild Wild West was the ultimate program. First of all, it was forbidden fruit because it was on Fridays when it was Shabbat, when it was Shabbos. So the program was on in Central Time where I grew up. I think it was on from 8 to 9, I think. It might have been 9 to 10 in the East Coast. 8 to 9, or maybe 7 to 8, perhaps. But because we were only able to watch it in the summer months when the Sabbath came in later. So we would watch the reruns. And it was color. What was the first year for the Wild Wild West? Was it 65?
65 was the first year, then it switched to color in 66.
And now that show, again, we talked about it. I talked about it, Yitzchak, it's the first steampunk program, right? And steampunk is now a tremendous genre of literature. And this was a program that had, all these sort of antiquated, futuristic items that West and Gordon had, and also had, for people who don't know, I think one of the best buddy chemistries of any program. There was another program, I think it was 1968, Alias Smith and Jones, or 69. That was sort of
a little bit later. I forget the year.
Yeah, it tried to replicate 69 or 70. It tried to replicate some of that spirit of the Wild Wild West, but you actually had Robert Conrad doing most of his own stunts. I mean, he was obviously a physical fitness guru, and he would fight like crazy, as he was. And then you had a real great character actor, a Jewish fellow by the name of Ross Martin. And Ross Martin loved putting on all these costumes and accents, and it wasn't like Sherlock Holmes and Watson. It was almost like you have the master of disguise intellectual, and then you have the sort of strident, courageous fighting guy, and that was a great team. And it also was interestingly placed post the Civil War, which we know was sort of like a period that things were sort of like in upheaval in the United States. You had carpetbaggers, and the idea that Ulysses S. Grant couldn't control the country made sense. So I think the program's idea was great. And, I forgot, I'm blanking on the villain. The main villain, of course, was he had a great, they gave him his Professor Lovelace, right?
Yes, there we go, yeah.
Professor Lovelace. Again, you can look him up, who played him. But do you think the show was canceled because it turned color?
Well, I think because they wanted to make the show more violent in color. And from really what I found, it was almost like a sacrificial lamb. It was a thing called the National Commission on Violence. And, there were congressional hearings, things like that. And they kind of said, hey, kids are seeing this violent show and they're going to then become violent. And so this is, again, kind of after Superman, when they toned that down, this was kind of all right, you know what? We'll cancel Wild Wild West. Like, this will make you happy. So.
And really, it's unfortunate. I don't know how many years it could have lasted.
Yeah. It could have lasted a while. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, obviously, part of it was Conrad's vitality. Artemis Gordon, I think, suffered a heart attack a couple of years later and died, but I think in 1974. But still, I think the show could have
went on till then.
The show definitely would have, like I said, they could have, and again, especially since, unlike World War II, Yitzchak, where, how many years are we in the war? MASH is so ridiculous. The show was on for 20 years or whatever, and the Korean War was like 3 years or 4 years. Like how is it that Hawkeye is gray and old, right? And a couple of years ago, like he looks totally different. The idea of an endless war, right, just to keep the television show going was sort of ridiculous. But they could have actually aged, Smith and Gordon, in the Wild Wild West. They could have continued. It could have really lasted.
That show could have absolutely continued for a while, but it was almost like this. All right, you're breathing down our neck. We'll cancel. What's public enemy number one? We'll cancel that one.
So let me ask you, you mentioned its violence. You're talking about Superman's violence. But I think it isn't so much television wanted to eliminate violence. They didn't want a show that was a kid magnet, like Superman and like the Wild Wild West, to have that violence. The detective shows, look, Mike Connors, those fights were, Mike Connors was always fighting people and there was always a good 5-minute fight where people were hitting each other, right? The detective shows, why wasn't there that type of scrutiny from the detective shows?
Actually, over the weekend, Buddy and I were talking about Gunsmoke, or the Rifleman, excuse me.
Chuck Connors,
and pretty much the every lesson of the show is, all right, I'm going to try to show my son, not to use violence. but eventually he's going to shoot somebody.
Right.
That seemed to be the arc of every show. It was like, I'm going to try to resolve things, but nope, we're going to shoot somebody now.
Has there ever been a more sophomoric child than the child, though, on The Rifleman? I mean, could you believe these are father and son? I mean, he's like this doe-eyed, but Pa, and Chuck Connors is sort of like, this
tough guy and the kids seen him shoot somebody a lot.
Right now, the Rifleman did the Rifleman ever get to be color?
Yes. No, Rifleman no.
Rifleman never got. The show that Chuck Connors was in color was another great theme song colored show. And you know what I'm going to say? Branded had one of the great theme songs. And I don't know if it ever became a top 40 hit, but it's an what is it called? An earworm, right?
Yeah.
Right? What do you do when you're branded, right? Et cetera, right? Wherever you go for the rest of your life, you will know, right, Schmuppy? You're a man. Dun, 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 dun. So Brandon was
here for you singing the theme songs.
Yes, Brandon was Chuck Connors. That was his color entry.
Yes.
Now, how long? I don't know how many years that lasted.
I think it was 1 or 2 seasons. It was not very long.
It's sort of like a ripoff of The Fugitive going back in the past, right?
Yes.
You have a person who is.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, Fugitive in the past. It's probably
right,
a good.
Right. Look, I would say in acting chops, David Jansen, Chuck Connors, sort of a toss-up. I don't know. But as you again, I interrupted about The Man from U.N.C.L.E. The Man from U.N.C.L.E. You would think you would think that going to color would make it more James Bond-like, but I guess they couldn't really justify it.
Yeah, couldn't replicate it for TV. Yeah, so then with that there came also the spin-offs like The Girl from U.N.C.L.E., which just started getting silly. Another show, another World War II show, 12 O'Clock High. And that show really suffered because they used a lot of World War II stock footage.
From Hollywood, right?
Yes.
There was actually Yitzchak, you can look it up. There was a film called 12 O'Clock High. I think it was with Van Johnson and Spencer Tracy, I think.
Yeah, it was with Spencer Tracy, and it's one of those highly regarded films by the Air Force, and it became a TV show, and Robert Lansing, and in black and white, it was really cool, but when it switched to color, they had to colorize all the stock footage that they had of bombers and fighter planes in World War II, which just didn't look right. It just looked cheap.
Well, one of the things that I think the 60s did over the 50s, Tom, was unlike Lucy, like the I Love Lucy and some of the original programs, there were never any location shots. Everything was on a set. And in the 60s, they decided to shoot outside. You would see, even the lot that, of Mayberry, there was at least something going on. There was at least, Andy going out to the lake to think or whatever it was. So the 60s really brought in the idea of we're not just shooting like on a sound on one set. And they would give the like, for example, one of the shtick that movies, television shows from the 70s and 80s do, shows like Mary Tyler Moore or Cheers. In between scenes, they'll give you a bus like riding in Boston, or a picture of a hotel in Minneapolis. The idea of you're creating the illusion that this is happening in the real world. So when you have a movie, 12 O'Clock High or The Rat Patrol, any of these shows, they're going to have to show you, battles and things happening in color in the real world, which they weren't able to do.
Whereas, the honeymooners, I don't think anything was outside of that apartment.
Right. And I actually remember the honeymooners. And I want to talk about two more things about that era. Yeah. The variety. Before we get to the bread and butter, which is the superhero shows that we started with, the variety programs. You talked about Skelton being in color. Jackie Gleason, of course, came back. I guess in 64 or 65. When I don't know when his program came back.
He came back, I think 65. I could be wrong about that. But 66 was the year that he brought back the Honeymooners on that.
Right, which is where I remember the Honeymooners from. And he did have Art Carney with him, Skelton. We know variety shows. Jimmy Dean, I know his show was in black and white in 64, 65. Jimmy Dean, the country singer.
Yes.
Right. But
his variety show was black and white. Yes.
His black show was black and white. But those variety shows, how did they do in the black and in the color? Just as good. I mean, they were still in those top couple ratings spots that season. So the variety show was not going away at that point. Right. It was interesting though that Hollywood Palace, which I think premiered, I think in 67 or 66 or 67.
Hollywood Palace was 65, I believe.
65. Okay.
And Adam West hosted
as Batman. Right. He hosted a color version of that. Right. And that also became color as well. Hollywood Palace. Right. So those shows, variety shows, if anything, were probably enhanced by color. People enjoy. Thanks for joining us for another episode from the Yeshiva of Newark at IDT Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss a single episode.